This on. Please keep eating, everybody. Sorry to disturb this delicious meal. I see. How's the tofu? It's good. The vegetarian meal looks good. Thank you all for coming. I know we're all getting ready for the Chinese New Year break. Many people have already gotten on their flights or booked their flights or heading to the airport tonight. So we're really appreciative of you coming out for this really interesting talk today. We've got a couple more. If you have not gotten on the flight you want and you're going to still be here tomorrow, there is another lunch coming up tomorrow. I believe it's a luncheon panel called Policing Hong Kong's Police: How to Restore Trust. We were trying to decide between that and solving Middle East peace, and we decided maybe we'll go for restoring trust in the Hong Kong police. So if you're around tomorrow and you want to restore trust in the Hong Kong police, please be here for that. And then we're going to take a little bit of a break. We'll still have a lot of activities, a lot of food and beverage activities going on. I heard there's a lion dance even coming up at some point. It's not on my list here, so I can't remember what it is. But please keep your calendars open. Please go to the FCC website and look for our upcoming events. And when we come back on Tuesday, the 11th of February, we're going to have a networking event for early career journalists and editors and others. So if you're looking to meet some early career journalists, or if you are an early career journalist, or I'm not quite sure how we cut off early career, but please come by anyway and say hello. And we will have a lot of events going on over the Chinese New Year, so please come back and have a look around. This is going to be a really, really interesting talk today. I mean, most of you probably know of Liu Xiaobo, winner of the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize, I believe. And he was not able to attend the ceremony, and he was represented at the ceremony itself by an empty chair. The old saying says, behind every great man there's a woman. And most of us probably have not really known much about Liu Xia, other than the fact that she was the wife and now widow of Liu Xiaobo. I actually wrote about her without actually having met her, because she was under house arrest. Not for nothing she actually did, but because she was the wife of Liu Xiaobo while he was imprisoned. I actually just went, while we were sitting here having lunch, I actually went back and found the story I wrote in February of 2011, when she was able to, because it was Chinese New Year and the guards weren't paying close attention, use an old computer and sneak out a few words to a friend, the transcript of which I came into possession of. And she wrote, "I'm crazy here." She said, "I don't know how I managed to get online. Don't go online, otherwise we can all be in trouble. I can't get out. My whole family are hostages. I only saw him once," she said, referring to Liu Xiaobo. "I'm miserable. Don't talk. I'm crying. Nobody can help me." That was all I knew about Liu Xia until Nick Frisch came. And he let us know that she actually was a prominent poet during the Beijing's kind of opening days in the 1980s, and she actually had a career as an artist. And after the unfortunate tragic death of Liu Xiaobo of cancer in 2017, I believe it was, she emigrated to Germany, where she now lives, and she has restarted her career as an artist. And that's what we're going to hear about today, is Liu Xiaobo's widow, Liu Xia, stepping out of the shadow of her husband, restarting her art career, and how the events of the last years and decades of China have affected her art. The best one to tell it here, I can't think of anybody better than Nick Frisch, who's he wears two hats, really. He's a scholar and a journalist. Some of us would like to do well at either. He excels at both. He's a media fellow at the Yale Law School, which I'm told is actually not a lawyer, but advising the lawyers and law students about media issues. And he's also a PhD student in East Asian Studies at Yale. And maybe he'll tell us when the PhD is going to be finished. And he's also a journalist. You've probably seen his articles in the New York Times, the Atlantic, Foreign Policy magazine, as well as the New Yorker, which is one of the most prestigious magazines in the U.S., where this interview, I believe, with Liu Xia first appeared. And that's why we asked him to come and be with us at the club today. And he's an old friend of the club. You might remember him, so please. Might I ask you also, just remember to turn your phones on to silent if you have not done so. And then let's welcome Nick Frisch.
Thank you so much, Keith, for having me here, and your very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be back at the FCC and to see so many familiar faces and some new faces in the room here today. Special thanks to Keith, of course, and also Jody and Benny and Sarah and Carmen and everyone else who's worked so hard to make this event a success. And thank you especially to everyone who has come so close to Chinese New Year. I'm glad to see you're still in town to share some of Liu Xia's art here today. In Beijing, in the late 1970s, as the Cultural Revolution receded and a period of opening and reform began, one of the first signs of the thaw was the return of the sound of pigeon whistles to the Hutong alleyways of the old city. During the high tide of Maoism, traditional pastimes of the capital's leisured elites, calligraphy, collecting, keeping goldfish and crickets, the raising of pigeons, and the whittling of miniature wooden whistles for their tails, all of these were denigrated as backwards, bourgeois, and feudalistic. Any pursuit which turned inwards to explore an intimate internal world was discouraged or forbidden as an affront to the collective. In those fast-changing years after Chairman Mao's death in 1976, in the outskirts of the old city, in a concrete housing block reserved for functionaries of the Communist Party, Liu Xia, the teenage daughter of one high-ranking cadre, looked across the curved gray roof tiles and locust trees of Beijing's old city and saw the flocks of pigeons swooping and heard the whistle's mournful hum. Despite her family background, or perhaps because of it, she was in a unique position to appreciate and capitalize on the political loosening of the late 1970s that allowed both the revival of traditional Chinese culture and an inundation of foreign influences that had been sealed outside of China for the entirety of her lifetime. Her father, a party member and bureaucrat in the financial ministry, was considered a politically reliable screw in the party machine and was trusted with a position here in Hong Kong, where he bought exotic books and photo albums, bringing them back to Beijing to broaden the horizons of Liu Xia and her siblings. He also arranged for private instruction in calligraphy, painting, and the terse, elegant prose and verse of classical Chinese. These are aesthetics that leave as much unsaid as they do said, and make canny use of emptiness. Later in her career as a professional artist, as Liu Xia became best known for sparse, shadowy photographs and poems, she continued to show the influences of traditional prosody and brushwork in other pieces, which she produced but rarely exhibited. During the most desperate moments of her later house arrest, she copied and recopied the Diamond Sutra, also known as the text of perfection of wisdom that cuts like a thunderbolt. The sutra describes a sudden blinding wisdom that shatters the illusions cloaking reality. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, as the Politburo debated the merits of opening up to the outside world, some leaders cautioned that too much change, too quickly, would unleash forces that the Communist Party could not control, threatening its monopoly on power. More reform-minded leaders said that the price of openness could be endured, arguing that when you open a window, some flies are bound to come in. The skeptics and hardliners countered that truly free markets in goods and ideas could never be tolerated, and that while some liberties could be allowed and their benefits enjoyed, markets must remain, fundamentally, a bird in a cage. Chairman Mao himself, in a speech to some newspaper editors decades before, had advocated dialectical cycles of tightening and loosening as the revolution found its way forward, invoking the ancient kings of Wen and Wu, whose ruling style was compared to pulling a bow tight and then letting it slacken. With the reform and opening in the late 1970s and 1980s, a cycle of loosening was beginning. As the universities in Beijing resumed their normal operation, young students flocked to the capital and formed the nucleus of a literary renaissance. Accumulated decades worth of foreign literature, art, and music poured into China. Beijing bohemians and intellectuals absorbed the Beatles, Bob Dylan, John Maynard Keynes, and George Orwell. Liu Xia especially adored Sylvia Plath, Marguerite Duras, and Camille Claudel. Sometimes this ferment bubbled over into the streets of Beijing. Through the late 1970s and over the following decade, a succession of street movements arose in the capital and elsewhere in the country. Activists put up posters and published unapproved periodicals. Occasional crackdowns and tightening resulted, driving the activity back into the scholars' studios and artists' salons, and punishing the unlucky or courageous few who took the strongest public stands. Liu Xia, considered by her parents to be their most rebellious child, read voraciously, but rarely the books assigned to her, and she showed no interest in studying for her college entrance exam. Her father's position might have helped her secure a post as an editor at a financial periodical published by a government work unit, the type of stable job known as an iron rice bowl, a dependable source of income, sturdier than a porcelain bowl that might smash into shards at an unexpected jolt. With new freedoms, Beijing became a center of poetic experimentation, dominated by cliques of wide-eyed and impassioned young men, mostly from the provinces. Liu Xia, a Beijing native, stayed largely cocooned in her work unit, aloof from this world. While others debated politics and philosophy in expansive terms, she experimented quietly with her own poetry and fiction, until gaining sudden renown for her 1983 poem, A Bird and Another Bird. We have, for so long now, spoken of that bird. We don't know where it comes from, that bird. We are enthralled. It brings us laughter. One winter night, that night, it came for real. We slept so deeply, no one saw it. It wasn't until sunrise that we saw its silhouette, lingering, pressed into the window pane. She met and married her first husband, an editor at the magazine, and the couple began hosting gatherings in their apartment. Her role was primarily as chef. One occasional visitor was Liu Xiaobo, a provocateur and poet from the provinces who was a rising star in Beijing's literary and scholarly scene. A friend who frequented Beijing's salons in those years recalled that Xiaobo would command attention, garrulously, showing off his brilliant intellect to anyone within earshot, waxing expansively, and some might say insufferably, on Wittgenstein or Proust, never using a single word when 4 or 5 florid synonyms might suffice instead. When Liu Xia attended these gatherings, she hovered on the periphery, rarely saying anything. But when she spoke, the friend recalled, what she said cut right through. The circle that she orbited, including Xiaobo, often wrote in expansive terms, and some would tease Xiaobo and say overbearingly. They published in unofficial underground journals. Liu Xia published in more open-minded official outlets and showed an artistic tendency away from expansiveness and towards a distilled minimalism, solipsistic structures that are always cutting down and condensing. In 1986, in a prestigious journal called Poetry, she published A Different Death, a free verse Gothic fantasia based on a scene from a European novel. In its original version, the poem has 3 stanzas. In a revised version, published years later, she cut out the middle stanza and put the 2 stanzas together, leaving the new poem a perfect mirror, its text reflected across a gap of empty space. In April of 1989, in the prestigious official journal People's Literature, she published Bookworm, literally paper fish, a work of experimental short fiction. For those who, like Liu Xia and Liu Xiaobo, lived through the 1980s in Beijing, there was no way of knowing how this decade, this period of loosening, would end, or who would write its ending. Xia and Xiaobo grew to admire each other as poets, occupying the same haze of cigarette smoke and cheap sorghum liquor, and the ethereal possibility of change in both art and politics. It was an atmosphere conjured by the words of Bob Dylan, who sang, "In the dime stores and bus stations, people talk of situations, read books, repeat quotations, draw conclusions on the wall. Some speak of the future. My love, she speaks softly. She knows there's no success like failure, and that failure's no success at all." On June 2nd, 1989, Liu Xia visited Tiananmen Square and sketched a poetic portrait of her friend, Xiaobo, who had become a core figure in the protest movement occupying the center of Beijing. In her poem, June 2nd, 1989, for Xiaobo, she wrote, "This is bad weather, standing beneath the lustrous sun. I said to myself, standing behind you, I patted the top of your head. Your hair pricked my palm, a strange sensation for me. There wasn't time to get a word with you before you became a character in the news, looking up to you along with everyone else. It exhausted me. I could only stand on the edge of the crowd, smoking a cigarette, watching the sky." After the crackdown, Xiaobo was arrested and imprisoned for 2 years. He lost his university job, and his wife had divorced him. Liu Xia and her husband had separated amicably. Xiaobo and Xia started dating, though her friends initially warned her off him. They moved in together, savoring a shared love of poetry and books. They wrote long poetic dialogues, and he called her Little Shrimp, a homonym for Xia, meaning the rosy clouds of dawn or dusk. He continued writing political essays, mostly for publications overseas, and haunted Beijing bookstores with other reformist intellectuals. She claimed to have no interest in politics, supporting Xiaobo's personal choice to continue his activism, but sometimes rolling her eyes at his exuberant expansiveness and overbearing erudition. When he was home from prison, he was her muse, hamming it up for the camera. Liu Xia said that to her, he was never a philosopher, only a shagua, a silly melon, a goofball. Police pestered the couple and their friends. With Xiaobo refusing to relinquish his activism, the threat of a return to prison was constant. In 1996, he wrote her a poem with his typically vivid and variegated images. Vanishing for Xia. I know that I should vanish, that pain disappears with time. To make the sound of your voice sticking to my thoughts like moss to a stone, vanish in a sour swell of seawater. To make your moonlight like a flame ignite my thoughts like dry kindling, reducing to ashes a woodpile in my mind. That year, he was rearrested and returned to prison. The following year, Liu Xia wrote a rueful poem which obliquely invoked the alcoholism of her idol, Marguerite Duras, to explain her infatuation. That goddess of wine, Duras, told me, one must always ensure that dangerous things don't fall into one's hands. I understand how hard that is. Because they had not been formally married, she could not visit him in the labor camp. So she applied to marry him, and they held a ceremony at the facility, with friends and other inmates in attendance. After his hair was shaved in prison, she cut hers short as well, and has kept it that way ever since. As her husband became a well-known prisoner of conscience, it became impossible for her to work inside China. Outsiders took an interest in exhibiting Liu Xia's photographs overseas. Her best-known series, Ugly Babies, juxtaposes dolls with howling expressions against eclectic, textured scenes, both indoors and out. In other posed photographs, she brings out fine details in the surface of gnarled wood, or a doll with a smashed face, and with piles of crumpled silk. Inanimate objects rendered in intimate detail, taking on a vividness that makes them almost human. In 2008, Xiaobo was arrested for the final time. On Christmas Day in 2009, he was sentenced to over a decade in prison. The following year, when he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, the announcement sent a crush of journalists to the gates of Liu Xia's apartment compound in Beijing. Her world tightened even further. Though she had never been accused of any crime, she lived under de facto house arrest, rarely able to see friends or use a phone or computer. Plainclothes police guarded her apartment. She passed long days alone at home, reading and smoking, occasionally writing poems, and copying page after page of the Diamond Sutra, which she jokingly called her homework. Sometimes once a month, sometimes less frequently, she was able to visit Xiaobo in the prison, a train ride to the northeast. After a mental breakdown and a fragile recovery, she produced a series of glistening foil shapes, suspended like celestial bodies in black space. The crumples of foil seem to have been found in the distant cosmos. Then, she subverts our expectations and reverts to a human form whose solitude and constrained circumstances invite fascination and pity wherever the theme returns across her work. In the summer of 2017, when Liu Xia was abruptly summoned to the prison, she could tell the news would be bad. Xiaobo, diagnosed with late-stage liver cancer, had been moved to a nearby oncology ward where police stood guard and where bars were installed on the windows. His wife was allowed to be with him for the first time in years, as the Chinese authorities, under international pressure, released images to show that their prisoner was being treated humanely. As he weakened, he still managed to be his ecstatic and verbose self. In his last letter to her, which he wrote in his hospital bed as she sat alongside, he said, "A bird and another bird have flashed before my eyes. Once you have grasped an individual's aesthetic style, it stays with you forever on the journey of life." Little Shrimp's poems emerge from the place where ice and shadows meet, as if she had photographed her own poetry in black and white. Ecstatic madness and calm stillness in the face of agony, like the suffering little doll with its face smashed away and throat stuffed with smoldering cigarettes. Like the wooden figurines draped in black silk, who look like the women come to see the resurrection of Christ or the witches of Macbeth. No, no, none of these. What comes from Little Shrimp's pen is unique. A solitary branch in a wild prairie, a gray horizon broken by a single dusty lotus flower, an offering to a wandering ghost. After Xiaobo died, Liu Xia was coerced to participate in a funeral stage-managed by the state and broadcast to the world. Then she vanished. For months, nothing was heard from her. In recordings that leaked out, she sounded more distraught and desperate than ever, as if she was contemplating suicide. A few days before the one-year anniversary of her husband's death, after pressure from Germany and the United States, Liu Xia's house arrest was lifted, and she flew to Berlin. During her recovery and resettlement, she has stayed mostly aloof from the local artistic and Chinese-speaking communities, reinventing a routine for a life in a world she has never known and never desired. Her work has been exhibited in Frankfurt and Taipei, but she herself has made few public appearances. She misses Beijing. She cooks at home, and she retains a talent for the laconic, darkly funny, razor-sharp rejoinder. When we sat in a backyard in Berlin and watched as another very thirsty guest quickly filled the table with empty beer bottles, she remarked tartly, "Well, at least I know I'm sick." When friends from the exiled dissident diaspora extravagantly praise her late husband, she rolls her eyes indulgently. She has described exile as 另一种残酷, another kind of cruelty. Having spent so much of her adult life trapped on the inside, looking out to the horizon, she's now forced to remain in an unfamiliar world, looking back in as if through a pane of glass on her life in China and on a love story that she can see but no longer touch. Before he died, Xiaobo said that he hoped for her to be able to go abroad. What might he think of her now? How might he have ecstatically embroidered her words and images to describe her new life? He isn't here to tell us, but we might perhaps get some approximation again in the words of Dylan, who sang, "My love, she's like some raven at my window with a broken wing." Thank you.
Thank you very much. You can stand or you can
Stand.
sit,
I
whichever
can
you
stand.
prefer. Okay, that's fine. And I'll take the moderator's prerogative to ask the first question. If you could delve a little deeper into Liu Xiao's mindset now in Germany, is she bitter? Is she angry? Is she resigned and moving on with her life? I mean, how would you describe how she feels from what you could get for her when she looks now at what's happening in China and perhaps Hong Kong?
Yeah. Uh, the impression that I got from relatively limited interactions was of a deep, deep trauma that's still being reckoned with. And even when she was in Beijing, she was a relatively solitary person by temperament. So the experience that she went through was something that might have amplified a tendency that was already there. So to be in such an intense experience for so long, those who know her better, who have known her for years, have said that she's still in a process of decompression, trying to learn a little German, trying to read more, trying to figure out how to make life as a professional artist in the West. And in general, not that interested in public appearances or discussions about current events and that sort of thing. So it seems like it's still relatively early stages for her, but I think she understands that the prospects for an immediate return are not good. And so I think she's looking for sort of a new way forward within the constraints that she faces.
Just to follow up that,
Yeah.
you think she's resigned that she will never go back to China, or is that kind of a hope that she holds on to that she might actually return, or is she happy in her new place?
She's happy to be free, but it's a very unfamiliar world. And so I think, like many people who have lived the entirety of their lives in a system that can be all-consuming, even if it's difficult at the time, when you leave, there are aspects of it that will make you sentimental. And I think that's what makes it so difficult. I think she would prefer to be able to have a free life and to be among her family and friends in Beijing for the, be able to see them more freely and to go shopping and so on and so forth. So it's mixed. It's definitely mixed. It's a tragedy common to a lot of exiles, I think.
No, absolutely. If you have questions there, we have a microphone, I believe, so please wait for the mic and just tell Nick who you are. And I know we'll have a few questions because I have at least one student here. We'd better ask a question, but next to her first.
Hi, this is David Kwan, associate member. How is she supporting herself in Germany? Does she have adequate economic means, and is she selling her artwork by any chance?
She is selling her artwork. She's on an artist visa, and Berlin is actually not that expensive. You may have had a cousin or a friend from art school who's moved there. It's, many of us do. Berlin is pretty affordable, so it's a good place for artists to be, and I believe she's on an artist visa working there.
Let's have another question. Hold on one second. There's a mic right behind you here.
Nick, don't answer if you don't, because,
Okay.
I'm very curious, or if anything, a little bit worried about her life now. But it's the thing that if I shouldn't ask, just stop me. But she's safe, right? I mean, you kind of know what I mean, and also, does she has a support circle that looks like she really needs. I mean, I assume she doesn't need publicity, and if anything, she needs.
Could you all hear? He's saying she's.
I can repeat the question.
Yeah, please.
The question was, does she have a support circle? Is she safe? Is she in a stable place? She does have a support circle. It is sometimes the case with high-profile individuals from China who are associated with dissident circles who end up abroad, that their effectiveness changes, and you may be alluding to the fact that their safety and their ability to live outside and be effective outside is sometimes under question. She's a bit of a different case because she's so explicitly non-political, and in her own telling, she feels that circumstances have made her into a symbol for something that she herself would not have chosen. And she understands why that is, but does not have a strong personal interest that I could detect for the time being in becoming a prominent member of those circles based overseas and bringing that kind of attention on herself. I think her support circle tries to draw from people who are not as much in the circle of the high-profile dissident diaspora.
And I think the first part of that question was if you can speak to it. Is she sick? Is she health? Is she safe?
Safe.
Is she safe? I see safe.
Yeah.
Is she safe? Yeah.
Yeah. So her wellness and her struggles with mental health issues and a heart condition are a matter of public record that's been written about in the media before her release. So to the extent that it's better to get treatment and be in Germany where she is now, I think you can say that she's in a better place for that with a better support circle. But as per Keith's question, it's incredibly disorienting to be torn away from this world. It's the only world you've ever known. And all of the cruelness and kindness that you've experienced has existed in that world. And to make your way somewhere where you don't know the language or have much familiarity with the international scene, that does impose another kind of trauma that I think she's still reckoning with.
Great. I see a hand up here. Just wait for the mic is right behind you.
You've said that she's not political, but has she said anything about where her thoughts about where China's going, and not even so much politically, but just the artistic? I mean, she experienced, as you said, that 1 year where they had all those freedoms. What does she say about younger people now in China and where things are going? She talked about that earlier.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. In terms of, has she said anything about where China is going? No. In terms of the artistic scene, one thing that she always has insisted on, and which is largely corroborated from other people, is that in this artistic ferment in Beijing in the 1980s, she was even relatively aloof from that scene when she was there in the 80s. Kind of a quiet and peripheral figure overshadowed by these much noisier, usually men, who are active in artistic and intellectual circles. And so she claimed, with I think some justification, to not pay much attention to artistic trends and the artistic scene. I think she said she said something like, "I would never mix it up in the jianghu, the sort of the world of artists and the wenren xiangqing, the sort of the backbiting and the sort of the arts scene in Beijing, whatever that was." Because she was active. There were a number of famous poetry movements that came out of Beijing in that period of time, including the very famous Misty poets. And her poetry has some overlapping characteristics with the Misty poets' poems, but she claimed to barely know the guys. So I don't think that she would have anything to add about the current scene, and I very much not even sure she's ever set foot in 798 or a place like that. But if she had, she'd probably claim she hadn't.
Yes. Definitely have to have one for my student.
So I'm Stannis, a student from the University of Hong Kong, and I feel it's very sweet and also kind of inevitable that the media always treat Liu Xiaobo and Liu Xia as one. But sometimes I can't help but wondering that as Liu Xia has very soulful art and poem, but for a lot of times she appeared on media as Nobel Peace Prize winner's widow.
Right.
And also at the same time, she repeatedly claimed that she's not so interested in politics. And I wonder, how do you think of like how the media like portrayed Liu Xia more like focused on her husband sometimes in a way?
Yeah.
Because she's an artist herself, so.
Yeah, that's right. Inevitably, when you have a close family member who becomes part of a major news story, and that person is not available to the media, there is always interest in people who are more available to the media. And that's why you saw that crush of journalists outside her apartment in 2010 and on some later occasions. There were also some times when journalists managed to elude the guards on a slow day and speak to her, or she would get a few minutes of a phone conversation with the outside world. And when you're trying to tell a relatively complicated story in a short news article, it's understandable that journalists would cast her in her primary role as auxiliary to this major news story, but the only person who is able to speak directly. The fact that she herself was under an unofficial house arrest made it part of the story as well. But I understand why in a lot of media stories there was the tendency to reach for the wife of the great man theme. I would note that some of the stories that appear in those articles are apocryphal. One of the most reprinted ones is something that Liu Xia is supposed to have said when she got married to Liu Xiaobo in the labor camp. And supposedly the camp guard said, are you sure you want to do this? The person doing the registration. Do you want to marry this enemy of the state? And she said, yes, that enemy of the state. I want to marry him. It's reprinted in a lot of news articles, and she claims it never happened. So.
Do we have any more questions? Because, yes, one more here.
What started your interest in Liu Xia, and is it related to your research, PhD research?
Thank you. My PhD involves partially traditional literati, Wenren, and how they expressed their art and literature in more modern forms of expression. So to the extent that I have a little bit of background in classical Chinese, I'm certainly on the lookout for modern artists who channel some of that aesthetic. I had also read some of his articles and essays in the course of sort of when news stories would happen or there would be books lying around. I didn't have a special interest in her beyond that, but I happened to be in Berlin when she was there, and so that was why I thought it might be an interesting story.
Yeah. So you mentioned that she realized she was a symbol of things that she may not have meant to be. Was one of those feminism? And she seems to have led, in some ways, an independent life. And even though it was interesting, you mentioned the first with the parties, she was the chef. She was
Yeah.
not one of the intellectuals. She wasn't part of really the debate, except occasionally. But do you think she would think of herself that way if she were being honest about it?
As a feminist?
Yeah.
Absolutely. You know, she's had certain privileges growing up that are complicated privileges, because when you are the daughter of a high-ranking party member, you have certain opportunities and resources that might not be available to many people. And that includes some of the luxuries about the opportunities you can give your own daughters. And there were aspects of the regime that were more favorable to women, and they even lived up to those ideals in some modest ways. In Beijing, in the higher ranking circles, there were opportunities for women. But it's also true that those women were often somebody's wife or somebody's daughter. And in the dissident circles in Beijing in particular, there was a tendency for these very loud, hard-drinking, hard-smoking men to dominate the center of conversation, and the wives and the girlfriends would be in the kitchen making dumplings. And even if they themselves had things to contribute in their own right, those traditional gender roles would play out. So I don't think she has any grounding in modern academic feminism. It's not something she would have learned in school in the Mao years, and she didn't go to college. She started working immediately afterwards. But certainly the necessity of having a degree of independence, and she would just call it rebelliousness or being difficult. But yeah, she had opportunities that maybe other women wouldn't have had, and she made the best use of them that she could.
And final question? We get a microphone here for a final quick question, because we're just running out of time.
Just as sort of like a corollary, I would think of it as to Jodi's question just now, and assuming that Xia is authentic in her proclamation that she's not political, did you get any sense from her that she had fear at around the time that Xiaobo was participating in the authoring of Charter 08?
Mm-hmm.
And was there any sense that you could gain of struggle or negotiation between them, that what they had was special, what they had was precious, and this is between, Xia and Xiaobo, and not wanting him to go so far to step over the line for fear that it might all be taken away?
Yeah. I don't know if there was ever any conscious negotiation like that. From what I understand, there was some discussion about, do you really need to do this? Do you really need to go through with this? Looking in hindsight, the fact that he only got 2 years after '89 is pretty remarkable. I mean, you really have to be committed in the face of every inconvenience to persist with that kind of activity. So I think they always knew that it was a risk. I think she would have been perfectly happy if he had not felt compelled to keep going. But he wasn't able to stop. And so when that specific document was being prepared and he was about to be arrested for the final time, I don't have any specific knowledge of the back and forth, but I knew there had been some back and forth. And if I were to make an educated guess, I would say that her response at that time might have been something like, again, really? Again with the petitions? Like, whatever. Fine. She would sort of often roll her eyes, like, okay, whatever. Mr. Philosopher, go do your thing, and we'll just deal with it.
Well, Nick has been a regular here at the FCC, and he's spoken here, I think, about a year ago. And so we had to scrounge around to find a gift that you did not already have. But I would like to say we did find something thanks to our able staff. Thank you. And Shinyan Kwaila, thank you for coming again. Please give a warm welcome or a warm round of applause.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And don't forget we're going to solve the policing problem tomorrow.
Thank you.